everybody. I suppose we could get this show on the road, huh? Can you hear me? Now we got it? All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Everybody hear me okay? All right. Well, let's get started. Welcome to week 5, lesson 5. We'll begin with, I thought a prayer from a hymn. A hymn verse would work well today. Preserve your word, O Savior, to us this latter day, and let your kingdom flourish. Enlarge your church, we pray. O keep our faith from failing, keep hope's bright star aglow. Let nothing turn us from you while wandering here below. Amen. I figured that's fitting because we're going to hear about the word being preserved among us as a synod, but also how the kingdom will flourish afterwards in some surprising ways. First of all, it is a great day for church history again today. This week in, oops, here we go. All of a sudden it's not working. Did we freeze something? Did something freeze up here, I wonder?
Why would it work?
It was working before. Did something freeze up? Oh, okay. All right, this week in Wells history. Okay. This weekend, October 11th to 13th in 1892, Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin synod leaders and representatives got together at St. John's and 8th and Valete to form the Federation, or otherwise known as, it was all in German, Allgemeine Synod, Fund, whatever. Translated, the Joint Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, and other states. And this was that thing where we're each synod staying independent, but we're going to work together in different things. So one was worker training. We opened up the new seminary in Wauwatosa and the new mission work in Apache land. And then we're going to use the publishing house together. So that federation, kind of a big deal. It's the first step. Step 2 was then merging formally in 1917. Then you get the Wisconsin Synod as we know it today, and we have districts, and all that goes forward. And then October 17th, we'll talk about this later, October 17th, 1957, the first copy of Meditations rolls off the presses. That was kind of a big deal because it's still being published today. It's still being read by a lot of Wells members today, Meditations. So it dates back to 57. All right, today we're kind of moving forward a little bit in history. We'll cover 20th century a little bit more, especially last half of the 20th century. We'll talk briefly about the break with Missouri, but I'm not going to linger on that a lot because I know you had a Bible class on that a couple of years ago with Dr. Brown, and he knows a lot more about that than I do even. He wrote he wrote the book on it, doctoral dissertation on that. So, but maybe just to kind of get you thinking a little bit, think in the early decades of the 20th century, what challenges might the Wisconsin Synod have been facing in those first decades of the 20th century? Think 1900s through maybe 1940s or so. John? Great Depression. Sure. The Synod ends up, we talked about that last week, gets saddled with a massive debt that kind of just puts the brakes on any kind of mission work, and just in generally, I mean, it's just hard to do any kind of building projects or anything like that. Ministry expansion is tough.
How was the transition to English?
Transition to English is huge. It got accelerated by World War I, but there was always this resistance, this thinking that if we switch to English, are we going to lose our Lutheranness? Because there weren't a lot of resources available, good resources in English. So that was always there. And there's just this thinking that, can you express good Lutheran theology in English? Only in German. It's kind of funny. Back at the time of the Reformation, people thought the same thing about Latin to German. Oh, you can't do theology in German, you can only do it in Latin. Well, Luther proved otherwise. And I think we've proved otherwise too with English is okay. fact, there's a lot of languages you can do Lutheran theology in. But that transition was tough. I was reading a little bit about the history of St. John's. St. John's resisted that, I think, for quite a while. It wasn't until a little bit later, until like the mid-20s, where they finally got English services going on a regular basis. I remember I was pastor at First German in Manitowoc, and you read the history there, and it was like 1912, I think. They started having an English service on Sunday evening once a month. By 1915 or 16, it was twice a month, Sunday evenings. By 1819, it was it was every week, and it was the middle service of 3 on Sunday mornings. And then by the early 20s, that had been flip-flopped, where the German service was the only one in the middle, and the English ones were the first and third. And that continued until the early 60s. And I understand St. John's continued to have a German service until, I think, sometime in the 50s, when it sort of faded out of existence, is what I was told.
Wisconsin Lutheran College, St. Michaelis met there, which had German services up into 2000, like within the past 15 years.
I think even past 10 years, yeah. He mentioned that over at WLC, they used to have still a German, St. Michaelis, I think was the name of it, right. I think Pastor Langbartels used to, I think he was the guy who was going over there and preaching regularly in German. Still having, there's still a few people there. The last church that I know of that had, another church that had regular German services was St. Matthew's in Benton Harbor, Michigan. They used to get a vicar, the vicar who would preach, who could, best German-speaking vicar or German knowledge vicar in that class would go to St. Matthew's, Benton Harbor. They were still sending guys there until, I think sometime in the 2000s. That congregation had received a lot of immigrants, post-World War II German immigrants had come and settled in Benton Harbor. That church, I think, closed just a few years ago, actually, and merged with another church in the Benton Harbor area. But yeah, that English thing, and you know, I admire the pastors in that era, because most of them, for a good decade and a half, I'd say, were conducting true bilingual ministry, where everything, catechism, preaching, probably your shut-in work even, hospital, you were doing all that in English and German, and that is not easy. My brother's done bilingual ministry in Spanish and English for most of his ministry. I just don't know how he does it, frankly. That just is not easy, but to have a large percentage of our pastors, and I also admire the guys, there were pastors who went into early retirement or took calls somewhere else because they struggled with English and recognized the congregation here needs someone who can do this better than I can. And so there's stories of guys taking calls to someplace else where they know that was just more German than English, or they retired early because they just couldn't, they struggled with the English side of things. I think World War II is kind of an issue too. We'll talk a little bit about that ministry in World War II, how the Wells tried to serve the members, the military members of the Synod as well. And then, another thing that's going to be happening starting in the late 30s will be growing tensions with the Missouri Synod. Oh, I should also mention one other thing in the 1920s. There was a controversy that was within the Wisconsin Synod. I'm not going to get into great detail on it unless you want me to next week. I was going to talk about next week. I have kind of open for, there's all sorts of things we could talk about, and some of it I might just say, what do you want me to talk about? But it was something called the Protestant controversy. Started in 1924. It was a number of different events, and it just kind of rocked the Synod. It cost the Synod 2 seminary professors, including the president, J.P. Kaler. It cost the Synod 3 professors at Northwestern, at least, and about 30 congregations and pastors in other districts. So it was a thing, and it was not necessarily over doctrine. It was over other stuff. And part of it was just the fact that it was the 1920s played into it as well. So all these things are kind of things that the Synod has been struggling with and facing as you get into, as we move into the midpoint of the 20th century. Oh, go ahead, sure.
30 congregations that left, where did they go?
Those 30 congregations that left, where did they go? They actually formed initially their own, I guess you could say, church body. It was called the Protestant Conference. The name Protestant because they were protesting things that were going on in the Wisconsin Synod. They never had their own seminary or college or anything like that, but they did have their own publication called Faith Life, which until just a few years ago still published regularly. They haven't published an issue in probably about 5 years or so, and now I think, from what I understand, they're down to about 3 pastors, I think, or 2 pastors, something. It's died out, but it was a thing for a long time, and there's a lot of interesting stories about some congregations. Some of those congregations eventually migrated into other church bodies, some to the ELCA, some to Missouri. A few have come back to Wells over time. I think of Emmanuel up in Manitowoc was one. But
Maybe the start of the ELS?
she asked if that was the start of the ELS. That would not be the start of the ELS. The ELS started in 1917, 1918, when there was a big merger of Norwegian church bodies they were merging with another group, and there was a small group of Norwegian congregations that didn't agree with that because they felt that they were overlooking doctrinal differences. And so the ELS got started in 1918, a small group of Norwegian Synod congregations that didn't go along with that merger. And so they often were referred to as the Little Norwegian Synod, also though eventually the ELS, Evangelical Lutheran Synod.
Off topic.
Sure.
Why hasn't the ELS and Wisconsin merged if they're already in fellowship?
She's asked why the Wells and ELS have not merged. Because we have our different identities. Norwegians and I could just say that Norwegians and Germans, do we always get along? Although my wife is part Norwegian, I think, so and I think we get along okay. But they just different identity, and so they've always retained that, and wanted to. And there's no reason to force a merger, but we're in fellowship and we share a lot of stuff, and that's okay too. So, meanwhile, I'll just make a little excursus into our St. John's history here. Meanwhile, in Wauwatosa, and I have a personal vested interest in this because of this guy right here. That's Carl A. Otto, who comes to be the pastor here in 1927, served until 1954. That's my great-grandfather. So he was pastor here, and he was pastor here when this building was constructed and dedicated in 1929. So that was kind of a big step in St. John's history when that happened. And the fact, it's interesting, right before the Depression hits. So we got it done before you might not have been able to get it done. And so St. John's Church. And then one of his sons, Carl J. Otto, all right. There we go. Carl J. Otto, I think it's his youngest son, accepted the call to, accepted the call to come to St. John's as his dad's assistant pastor, and he comes in 1947 and will serve until 1973. So you have Pastor Carl Otto as the pastor here at St. John's from 1927 to 1973. They call it the Otto years. What also gets a little confusing in my life is that my father is also a Pastor Carl Otto. And so I will get people asking me, are you related to Carl Otto? And I will say, yes. Which one? You want to know about?
There have been other instances of father-son pastors serving together?
He asked about there are other instances of father-son pastors serving together, and I would say yes. I can think of some out in, or down in Racine, First Lutheran Racine, the Pope, pastor, father-son Pope. I think there was a similar one out in South Dakota at one time. So there have been some. It's not a common thing, I will say. It's a rarity. Interesting, at Carl Otto, younger Carl Otto's installation here at St. John's, my grandfather preached. He was pastor in Wilmot, Wisconsin at the time, so he is the one on, let's see the one on the second step there, the one second to the right. He preached. His dad, the father, did the installation right, and Ted, dentist, longtime organist here, like for 75 years, played the organ. And so, it was an Otto show, I guess. So I kind of get a kick out of the fact every time I come down here for Bible class, I say, oh, there's my great-grandfather, there's my great-uncle. So the Otto years. And then also in 1958, build a new school building. And that is, I guess, another example of something we'll talk about in just a second. The boom of building projects in the 1950s, it kind of starts post-war, and it's going to be everywhere in our synod, both at synod schools and at local congregations, and local schools are just going to be building, and we'll talk about that in a second. So there's your little foray into St. John's history here. So getting back to the synod history, so during the war, World War II, our synod, one of the things we were not agreeing with the Missouri Synod was on the military chaplaincy. We felt that there were reasons not to participate. Some of it had to do with the divine call. Some of it had to do with church and ministry issues, fellowship issues. And so we did not participate, but we worked very hard to still support and serve our military members who were our members who were in the military. This little brochure was published at one point, just talking about 20,000 members are in the military, and we are endeavoring to serve them by mailings, mailing devotional books, prayer books, sermons. In fact, a pastor was called to oversee the work. They called it the Spiritual Welfare Commission. And they had an office here in Milwaukee and numerous secretaries working to put all these mailings together and gather addresses and names. And they had 15,000, 20,000 Wisconsin Synod military personnel that they were communicating with on a regular basis. They also started sending out, they would send out little certificates that families could have when you sent the name in. They'd send the certificate, so you knew that the synod was taking care of them, was sending things to them. We started sending pastors to serve at different military camps in America, training camps. So this was Fort McCoy, a worship service at Fort McCoy in Wisconsin. But it wasn't just in Wisconsin. This was Easter Sunday in Alexandria, Louisiana. And the guy on the left is I think it's Erwin Schrader was the pastor who went down there to do some work. We had men stationed out, and we had a pastor or two out in California at some of the military bases out there to serve people as well. And congregations, I think, also did their own share of that too, and keeping in mind and praying for the military personnel who were serving. This is a picture. I love this picture for several reasons. First of all, you got to love a huge Christmas tree. Maybe don't have to love the fact that it's right in the middle of the chancel and blocking the chancel. But you can still see, you got the pulpit though, you can still see the pulpit. So that's right? That's what's important. But off to the left, right here, that board has stars on it, indicating the different members who were representing the members who were serving in the military. This is St. Mark's in Watertown, by the way. So just our synod was endeavoring to do that. And then Missouri Synod did have military chaplains, and so if they went overseas, we'd refer them to those Missouri Synod men who would serve them, because we were still in fellowship at that time. Post-World War II, you come out of the war, and we talked about this a little bit last week when we talked about the drive to go into overseas mission work, but there's also a lot of stuff happening in our synod as well as a whole. 1950, our synod celebrated its centennial. So this is kind of a cool, I think this was like a plate or something like that, and you see all the institutions of the synod here depicted. The seminary, to the right, Northwestern, in the middle, Northwestern Publishing House, Northwestern Lutheran Academy in Mobridge, Michigan Lutheran Seminary in Saginaw, and Dr. Martin Luther College in New Ulm. Every one of these places, with the exception of the seminary, will see massive building projects during these post-war years. The first one was Centennial Hall at DMLC, so named because of the centennial of the synod. That's why you get Centennial Hall. Anybody here ever live in Centennial Hall? I figured there might have been a few of you who did at one time or another. It was actually built to be the women's dorm, which was, I think, the first time that that DMLC had a designated women's dormitory on the campus. So this is what the campus looked like then in 1950 after that. On the Northwestern campus in 1950, they dedicated the library. Plans for that had been in the works already before the Depression, and they pretty much kind of stuck with the same plans. That's why that building kind of looks a little bit older than it really is. But they also built, in the 50s, a new dormitory, which is today Augsburg Dorm, as well as the chapel and the classroom building. The chapel was made possible because of a $100,000 gift from a lady in Manitowoc. There's a little plaque inside the chapel that says her name was Maida Michelson, I think is what her name was. So the Northwestern campus went from looking like that to looking like that by the mid-1950s. Just a remarkable, just a building project. And it's going to continue into the 60s and 70s as well, but just in the 50s you see all this going on. And similar things happened at MLS. This is the dedication, or the groundbreaking, or cornerstone laying, one of the two, at Michigan Lutheran Seminary for a major building project of classroom space. This is the dedication, this is the children's choir at the Northwestern, the Mobridge campus had a big classroom addition as well in the 50s, 1953. Something like 700 people gathered for that dedication, which is a lot for the Dakota-Montana district to get that many people together. So lots went on. And then on the local level, you see all sorts of building projects going on. I mean, it's kind of unbelievable when you stop to think about it. How many churches and schools have building projects, like St. John's, its school. This is Trinity in Watertown. Beautiful church building got constructed. Atonement in Milwaukee. Atonement in the 1950s had 2 school building projects and their church sanctuary, all in one decade, which also maybe tells you how fast some of these churches were growing in the 1950s. And it wasn't just in the Milwaukee area, too. This is Our Savior's in Zion, Illinois, where Pastor Carl Lyrer was the pastor with his young growing family, and they're adding like a fellowship hall kind of thing there to their church. And I was hoping Pastor Lyrer, he is back there. And I know Andrea here too might like this picture here. Which one are you, Pastor Lyrer? Andrea, which one is your mom? Yeah.
Plaid dress.
Okay, plaid dress is I know her as Mrs. Bivens, but but yeah, the Lyrer family there. So serving, but other places, all these, like I said, all these building projects going on, the schools growing. This is Salem in Milwaukee. So Salem in 1942 had closed their school because the enrollment had gone down so far. In 1947, they get a new pastor, Ray Wickman, and they start sending their kids over to St. John's, and so many families are coming into the neighborhood there and sending their kids to St. James that they say, we got to reopen our school and we need more classrooms. And so in 1949, they dedicated 2 new classrooms that are still there as part of the landmark church museum and everything, and their school just took off. Their congregation tripled in size in 10 years. Went from about 200 members to 600 members in just 10 years. So that kind of thing is going on. This is a picture of just the Northwestern Lutheran spread of all sorts of different school buildings and additions and places like, what do we got, Waniwak, Wisconsin, Winona, Minnesota, Owasso, Michigan. The one in the down in the bottom right is First German in Manitowoc. You got all this, just all this capital projects, all that are going on. And if that weren't enough, they start 5 new area Lutheran high schools. This is the Cornerstone Lane at Fox Valley. And this is the first day of classes at Lakeside, and Manitowoc Lutheran High School, and St. Croix Lutheran High School, and Luther in Onalaska, the La Crosse area. All 5 of those get started in the 1950s. And if that weren't enough, the joint Missouri-Wisconsin Synod High School in Milwaukee in 1955 decided to split into a separate Missouri Synod High School and a separate Wisconsin Synod High School. I think they did it for a couple of reasons. One, it was getting too big, and they just needed building projects, and I think they felt it would be more if, maybe we need 2 high schools. I think they also maybe saw the handwriting on the wall as far as the potential break between the 2 synods. And so then in 1959, the Wisconsin Synod group finishes and dedicates Wisconsin Lutheran High School, which of course is still there on Blue Mound Road and Glenview. My mom, I believe, was the first. I think she was part of the first class that went all 4 years to the new building there. She started as a freshman in 1959 when this would have been dedicated. And again, this is a big deal too. This was not cheap. All these building projects that are going on, and other ministries get started too. One of the points of contention between the Missouri Synod and the Wisconsin Synod was over the scouting issue. We had concerns about the Boy Scouts because of works righteousness, kind of just a generic Christianity, the oath that had to be taken. There were just a number of reasons that we had concerns. And we didn't just say, okay, no, we're anti-scout, but we're also pro boys learning and girls learning some skills and having opportunities for fellowship. And so in the 1950s, we also start the Lutheran Boy Pioneer Program, train number 1. Anybody know where it's from? Or is it on there? St. John's, Burlington. It's train number 1. The Girl Pioneer Program got started not too long after that. I think that was based out of the La Crosse area, some places over there. So we get that going on. And then I mentioned meditations. Starts rolling off we figure we can write our own devotional books too. The Missouri Synod had Portals of Prayer. That was a popular one. Well, we can do this too. And so starting in 57, this week in 1957, the first one rolls off the presses. One other thing from a Synod administration standpoint also happened in the 1950s. Until 1959, the Synod president also served as a pastor of a congregation. And so Synod headquarters, you might say, was always wherever that pastor was serving. So for a while it was St. Peter's in Fond du Lac until 1933 when it became St. John's 8th and Valete. And then in 1953 when Oscar Naumann was elected president, it became St. John in St. Paul, Minnesota. But in 1959, the Synod finally said, the work of the president, it's kind of a lot. And we should make this a full-time called position. And so Pastor Naumann moved to Milwaukee. And a few years later, in 1963, they figured, he initially started using offices at NPH, but NPH was growing. And so they ended up purchasing this bank building on North Avenue, and this became the Synod headquarters. And so from 1960, I think it was 63, until the early 80s, this was the Synod headquarters down on North Avenue. So just all this stuff going on in the 1950s. And all of that on the backdrop of the tensions, the growing tensions with the Missouri Synod. And you talk to different people. How many of you have some kind of family connection with somebody in the Missouri Synod that goes way back? There are a few. I figured there would probably be still a few who know about things like that. My grandma Schutze, her family was Missouri Synod. There were all those family connections, and there was a lot of ministry that went together, that was working together. The Lutheran High School in Milwaukee was one example. There were the campus ministry in Madison was a joint Wisconsin Synod, Missouri Synod effort. Things like Bethesda Lutheran Home and a lot of institutional ministries. And maybe the last major project of the Synodical Conference that was done with Missouri and with all these different synods working together was the old Lutheran. Oh, I should also mention our two presidents had to just really work through a lot of stuff at this time, John W. Brenner and then Oscar Naumann. But the old Lutheran hymnal was published in 1941. And it was truly a joint effort. There were men on this committee from all the synods in the Synodical Conference. This is from John W. Brenner's personal hymnal that was gifted to him as a synod president from the committee with all their signatures on it. And so some of the men on here that were Wisconsin Synod members would have been William Schaefer, I'll show his picture in just a second, and Arthur P. Voss was pastor at St. James. Those two guys would have been the Wisconsin Synod representatives. Norman Madsen's name is on there. He would have been an ELS representative. This was a very much a joint effort. And there's William Schaefer. And so you had all these connections going on, but then you have the increasing tensions over the doctrine. And it started way back in 1938, or 39, when the Missouri Synods all of a sudden started having doctrinal conversations with the ALC, the American Lutheran Church. And those conversations, it seemed like they were kind of ignoring doctrinal differences that had separated, had kept those two synods and our synods separated over the years. And they did this without really even consulting any of the other synods of the Synodical Conference. So it kind of caught the Wisconsin Synod off guard too. And then we started noting as the 40s went along a lot of changes that were going on in the Missouri Synod that they weren't always admitting, but you could see them. And so this troubled those in the Wisconsin Synod, wondering what's going on. And eventually doctrinal discussions happen, and the Synodical Conference presidents all get involved. I thought I included that picture. Okay. We'll get to that in a second. The synodical presidents are involved. There's committees involved. There's discussions that go on in the early 1950s. 1955, a resolution came to our synod convention. Let's break. It's time to break. The ELS broke that year with Missouri. That resolution was voted down. Actually, first it was voted to delay it a year, and then it was voted down. And the same thing happened in 1957. It was voted down. And what that kind of tells me, and this is why I think, I don't want to get into a lot of the details of the whole break, but the timing of it, I think, is evidence of God's surprising grace to us as a synod. In the mid-50s, not everybody in our synod knew and understood the differences or what was going on in the Missouri Synod. Some did. This guy right here, Eric, this is Edmund Rhyme. He was the president of the seminary. He understood because he was working firsthand with, in a lot of these discussions. But it takes a while for all that to get filtered down to parish pastors and to lay people and everything like that. It just takes a while for that to happen. A couple of district presidents, M.J. Witt from the Pacific Northwest is the middle guy, and the right guy on the right is Paul Albrecht from the Dakota-Montana district. All three of those men become leaders in establishing the Church of the Lutheran Confession, or the CLC, in 1960, which was a break-off. Initially it was about 60 congregations and even more pastors and teachers and professors and so on who left to form this new church body in 1960. But not, like I said, not everybody was there yet in our synod. Had we broken earlier, I think we would have lost more to the Missouri Synod. But by 1961, when the 1961 convention rolled around, things were a little bit different. More people had become aware of things. I think the evidence of what's going on was becoming more evident. This is the Northwestern faculty in 1961. The two men circled on there were men who were very popular professors at Northwestern, but also very sympathetic to what was going on in the Missouri Synod, including some of the problems that were occurring over the doctrine of Scripture. Because eventually, after we break, it becomes more evident that there was a deeper problem in the Missouri Synod over the doctrine of Scripture. They had leaders, professors who were teaching that not all of the Bible is God's Word. One of the guys up there, Ralph Gerke, eventually wrote an article questioning the divine inspiration of the first chapters of Genesis, things like that. And these guys were very popular. I mean, they were influencing seminary students. I mean, my grandpa told stories about seminary students coming to Mequon and challenging their professors. Thankfully, they don't do that these days. So these two men in 1961, the summer of 61, took calls into Missouri Synod institutions. And so then the 1961 Synod Convention, which was held in the gymnasium at Wisco, the stage was set for this high drama. It was very heart-wrenching in some ways when you hear about some of the stories. I mean, the floor committee chairman of the floor committee dealing with the resolution, bringing the resolution to break with Missouri, was Pastor Werner Franzmann, who I think was at the time an NPH editor. One of the official observers from the Missouri Synod was his brother, Martin Franzmann, who was a professor at Concordia St. Louis. So you have at one microphone Werner Franzmann saying, "We have been patient long enough. We need to break." And you have a brother at the other microphone saying, pleading for more patience. And then the story was told by a third brother, Gerhard Franzmann, who taught at Northwestern, who just kind of sat up. He was up in the bleachers watching it, and just his heart was broken over that. And it was a sad thing. But the synod, I think, our Wisconsin synod, we kind of had to take a stand then. Because if we didn't break in 61, and by the way, when the vote was taken, it was like 124 to 49, so it was like almost 4 to 1, 3 or 4 to 1. If we hadn't broken then, I think we would have lost a lot more congregations and pastors to the CLC. Because I think more and more people were seeing the problems. But by breaking in 61, it stopped the flow of churches leaving. We lost a few. We lost a couple big ones to Missouri. St. John's in West Bend and St. Martin's in Winona were two big churches that we lost to the Missouri Synod. Over time, though, we gained a number of congregations from the Missouri Synod, such as St. John's in Watertown, which is why if you ever go to Watertown, you might be struck that there are two large Welsh churches that are literally across the street from each other. You might wonder, why in the world is that? In fact, their school buildings are literally on the same block. I think you can stand between them and touch them. But it's because one was Missouri Synod, one was Wisconsin Synod, and the Missouri Synod one came over to us in the 70s. Yes, sir. What happened to the CLC after we broke? He's asking what happened to the CLC after we broke. They have continued in existence. They are still in existence to this day. I'm actually the Wells observer of the CLC. I went to their convention last summer. They have about 6,000 members. They have a seminary, college, preps, or high school up in Eau Claire. They have a remarkable, actually I think for a church body their size, a remarkable world mission program. They support 3 full-time world missionaries and have contacts in like 17 different countries or something like that. And literally everybody who talked to me at their convention had a relative in Wells. I mean, everybody. And interesting, we have actually 2 seminary middlers right now who are graduates of their high school in Eau Claire, who left the CLC and have come over to the Wisconsin, who come over to Wells. So anyway, the break happens, and there were people who thought both within our synod and with outside of our synod, who thought, that'll be the end of the Wisconsin Synod. They're going to take their precious doctrine, go off into the corner, off into their little Midwest corner, and just kind of shrivel up and die. The exact opposite is what happened by God's grace. And also by God's grace, by surprising grace, because we broke, we were spared what went down in the Missouri Synod in the 1970s. The Missouri Synod faced a crisis that I think is just mind-blowing. I mean, when I talk about this to our seminary students, they are just, it just floors them. In 1973-74, there was a big showdown finally between a newly elected synod president and the seminary president of Concordia. And Concordia was the largest seminary, period, in America. Had like 600 students, faculty of 50. And when their synod, the synod president and their board, the board of control at the seminary, suspended the president because he was allowing false doctrine to be taught in the classrooms. And they had gone, this had been going, the investigation had been going on for 2-3 years. They had special blue ribbon panel, they interviewed all the professors, they had all this documentation and everything going on, and there were showdowns at synod conventions, it was crazy. And then in the winter of '74 is when it all went down at Concordia. When the president was suspended, 45 of the 50 faculty members basically went on strike, and 3/4 of the student body walked out. And it was all a made for media whole thing. I mean, they planted crosses in the quad of the seminary to show, we're different. They had a whole parade off of campus. And the story goes that as soon as the TV cameras went away and they got off campus, all the students hightailed it back to the cafeteria in time for lunch. Stomachs rule sometimes. But what ended up happening was, this is traumatic to a synod. And a rival seminary called Seminex eventually gets started by these professors and students who leave. It takes a while for Concordia St. Louis to get rebuilt. But all that, and we're sitting there in Wisconsin Synod looking at this, first of all, with sadness, but also kind of saying, okay, there was more going on. We might not have been able to put our finger on it back in the 50s and 60s, but clearly there was more going on. And again, by God's grace, we were spared a lot of this heartache and trouble. And instead of shriveling up and dying, things exploded in our synod as far as growth. And I would call it a golden age of growth in the Wisconsin Synod, particularly when it comes to home missions. Just to give you a little comparison here, and we'll see how far we're going okay. Between the 25 years of 61 to 86, you look at these stat comparisons, and the growth is phenomenal in my opinion. Particularly when you think of a lot of church bodies in the 60s and 70s were shrinking. Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, they were shrinking, and we're growing like gangbusters. You can see the kind of size, the number of pastors, that's 500, over 500 more pastors. The overseas missionaries go from 8 to 42, and in 2 countries to 9. Our Lutheran elementary schools grow, and double the number of teachers. DMLC just started churning out teachers to keep up with the need. We'll talk a little bit about that too. Seminary grows almost threefold. Just unbelievable the growth that you see. And a lot of it has to do with the geographical spread of the synod. So in 1961 we were in 16 states. And you can see primarily upper Midwest, West Coast because of the work on the Pacific Northwest, Arizona led to California, and then our little outlier in Florida. In the 60s, early 60s, the home mission office started getting all these requests flooding in. come and serve us with the pure word. The guy on the left is Ray Wickman. He was the first, in 1963, he was the first home missions administrator, full-time. Guy on the right is Edgar Heinecke. He was the first full-time world missions administrator. And Wickman kind of coined the phrase, every state by 78. It got to start somewhere, though. So by 1965, we had added another, 8 states? In 1965. Yeah, we were up to 24 states. So you can see we're even out in Alaska, but Texas, Missouri, Kansas, Alabama, a couple out east. The churches are growing and beginning. By 1970, and this is Alaska in the early 70s, and the couple on there, that's Dr. Mark Brown and his wife. He was doing a summer vicar thing there. And that was their church, Peace Lutheran. I think it was Wasilla, Alaska, or something like that, somewhere up in Alaska there. Or no, Eagle River, Alaska, that's what it was. By 1973, we've added, and we're up to, I think we're up to 45 states, and we have enough congregations to form the South Atlantic District. And these are the charter congregations in the South Atlantic District. All these churches prior to this had been part of the Michigan District. At one time in the 60s, I think the Michigan District comprised all churches kind of south, like draw a line from Lake Michigan down to the Gulf of Mexico. Everything east of that was the Michigan District. One of the congregations, I just want to point out this for the sake of Pastor Lyra back there, the church in Georgia, Atlanta, was called Sola Scriptura. Now you kind of say, what were we doing? Latin names of a congregation. Well, eventually there were 2 other Sola churches that were started. Sola Grazia in Perry, Georgia. That was Pastor Lyra's assignment out of the seminary. Mission Exploration. That was Sola Grazia. And yeah, I think the trend was already there because they also started one in Lawrenceville, Georgia, a northeastern suburb of Atlanta called Sola Fide. I vicared there at Sola Fide. Today, the only one left is Sola Fide. So apparently we only like faith, we don't like grace and scripture alone anymore. But yeah, we have the beginnings of a new district. We added district number 10 in 1973. And then by 1983, we made it to all 50. So every state by 78, almost. The last one, and here's we have 2 more districts then that get founded. The South Central District, so this is the first meeting of the South Central District in Calvary and Dallas, Texas in 1983. And then the North Atlantic District was also started. And this was the last state to get into was Maine. So beautiful Savior, Portland, Maine. Paul Yankee got assigned there out of the seminary to get that going, and we got to all 50 states. Today we have a presence in 48. We have a small preaching station in Maine. We have a very small preaching station in Columbus, Mississippi. We do not have churches in West Virginia or in Rhode Island. The one in Rhode Island moved across the border, across the state line, I think into Connecticut, and so that's why we don't have one in Rhode Island anymore. But otherwise, we're still in all 40. We're still in 48 of the 50. And again, when you think of this, all happens in the span of just over 2 decades. The geographical spread was just. I would imagine those of you. I mean, I was a kid. I mean, I was born in '69, so I kind of not aware of all this. But I imagine some of you are a little bit older, maybe kind of remember that, just how fast the synod is growing and how widespread it's becoming geographically so quickly. Eventually, you have a new Norm Berg there on the right, becomes the home missions administrator. He's there with Heinecke. The leadership those guys had to provide and trying to keep tabs of everything and process requests for grants to build churches and parsonages and all that and buy land and that's all you read about in these reports in the 60s and 70s. Need money, need CEF, Church Extension Fund. It was just kind of a big thing in those days. But it also carried over into world mission work. The expansion into other countries, again, happening rather quickly, and a lot of it happening because people learned about the Wisconsin Synod's faithfulness to the Word. And so they start reaching out, and we find people. And so 1964 we sent 2 missionaries over to Puerto Rico for the first time, Roger Sprain and Rupert Eggert. This is Sprain at a radio station, because radio ministry became a thing. Also in 1964, sent some missionaries to Hong Kong. This is Paul Bain, a missionary there baptizing in Hong Kong. 1966, seminary graduate Ernest Zimdars begins work he goes to El Paso to reach out into Mexico. We had to connect. We ended up gaining a Mexican pastor who had interest, Pastor Luna, and this is a wedding that he is preaching at in Mexico. In 1970, we got some connections with a guy in India. He actually came over to our seminary, spent a year there, got some training, and actually kind of graduated. T. Paul Mitra, and his wife was a medical doctor, and so our synod raised funds for them to get a van that they could do she could do her medical work, he could do his preaching and his outreach work there in India. 1973, a 3-man team gets commissioned to go to Colombia. So the guy on the left is Ernie Zimdars and his wife. In the middle is a teacher. What was his name? Wagner. Where do I have my? Yeah, or Werners, the Werners, and then on the right of the Sprains. So the Sprains went from Puerto Rico now to Colombia. In 1977, we have a 3-man team that gets sent to Indonesia. There's Howard Festerling teaching a group of children in Indonesia. 1979, 3 missionaries to Taiwan. This is Holy Trinity Church in Everlasting Happiness Village in Taiwan. I like the name there, Everlasting Happiness. And then in 1985, we sent some missionaries, a team over to Brazil. So just again, the phenomenal world mission growth that takes place, again, in the course of 20 plus years. Almost every synod convention, they're approving more missionaries. And all that work, it took the support of the lay people of Wells. I should have thrown up my quote. I have a quote from Norman Berg, where he says that he talks about how the doctrinal struggles of the 40s and 50s kind of provided the strength in many ways, the spiritual strength, so that coming out of that, we could do this mission work. And he was particularly talking about the home mission work, but just a lay-supported mission efforts. The amount of financial support, and again, it was taking place not just on the synodical or the synodical level. It was also on the local level. The 1970s also saw 11 new area Lutheran high schools built and started, and so you just had a lot of ministry going on in this era coming out of the break with Missouri. How much time do I have left here? I do have 5 minutes. Maybe I'll pause here just for a second. Any questions that anybody has? Please.
Just to kind of backtrack a little bit.
Sure.
When you were talking about like World War II and why we didn't participate. So, am I understanding you correctly? You said we didn't have anybody going over and serving as chaplains during World War II, but we were still connected with Missouri. But what was can you clarify a little bit about what was the problem with why we didn't participate?
Sure. She's asking about why we didn't participate in the military chaplaincy program run by the government. There were a number of reasons. First of all, historically, our synod had not, especially with going into World War II, the government had kind of changed some of its policies, but we were concerned, who's calling this person? Who's paying them? Who's supporting them? Are we getting too entangled with church-state things? And then are these chaplains going to be required to serve, is the guy going to have to serve communion to a Presbyterian or a Catholic? there were those kinds of concerns from a fellowship standpoint too. So we engaged in the civilian chaplaincy program, or we sent our own chaplains there, not paid by the government, not having ranks in the military and so forth, but like they would go and serve at these camps. During Vietnam, we actually sent some overseas. In fact, Carl J. Otto went to Vietnam for a while, got a leave of absence from St. John's and went to Vietnam, and eventually was the first guy who went over to Germany. And so we've had civilian chaplains serving in Germany since the early 1970s. So we've chosen to go that route. Does that make sense? Okay. Please.
Is the Mark on the principal here at St. John's?
I think it's spelled different. Yeah. She asked if it was related to Principal Mark Graff, spelled different. Yeah. We don't always know how to spell things, right? Or inconsistencies. Anybody else? And if you have a question, if I don't see your hand, just yell. But okay.
Going back to the English procurement, it would seem to me that there wasn't a lot of outreach to the English community, obviously, because there's not English in all of the churches in the early 1900s.
She's asking if there's outreach to English-speaking people because there weren't a lot of resources and so on. To some extent, I mean, outside of Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, I think you would have seen more, like out in the Pacific Northwest would have been outreach in English, out in Arizona that was going on. But I think more and more you start to see that. In some places, you ended up having English missions getting started. So for example, in Waukesha, have you ever wondered why Trinity and Grace are so close to each other? If you ever know that they're like, I think 6 blocks apart from each other in Waukesha. Well, Grace was the English mission because Trinity was dragging their feet going into English, but they said, okay, we'll start a different church over here. This is the English mission. And of course, then eventually they're all English, and now you got 2 churches that are 6 blocks away from each other. So.
And the problem, we had 2 Lutheran churches within a block of each other. Mount Olive became English and St. Paul was German.
Sure, she mentioned a similar thing in Appleton with Mount Olive and St. Paul's. Yeah. Now, of course, Mount Olive's relocated and they're a little more separate. But yeah, sure.
Who was the poor missionary that got sent to Hawaii?
The poor missionary was who got sent to Hawaii. I don't know who the first guy was. I know the guy who's been there. We do have a small church yet in Community Lutheran in Honolulu. I think that guy's getting ready to retire, though, and how many people are going to be lining up? Here am I, send me, right? But I think what I'll do is next week I will cover the last of the stuff on my notes here, and then what maybe I'll do is perhaps I could do it this way. Quick scan through my. We'll cover some of this stuff next week. But let me, oh, come on here. If you have specific questions or things you would like me to talk about, I have my email address here. Oops, I went too fast now. joel.otto@wls.edu. If you would like to email me during the week, if you got any specific questions, I'd be happy to kind of put a little something together with some of those. If you have specific questions, I can try to answer. joel.otto@wls.edu. There you go. So feel free to email me, and we'll